In 1984, a German historian named Alexander Demandt undertook something no one had attempted before. He combed through every academic paper, every book, every theory ever published about why the Roman Empire collapsed, and he compiled them all into a single list. When he was done, that list contained more than 200 separate explanations. 200. Everything from lead poisoning to Christianity, from moral decay to bad weather, from soil exhaustion to the rise of Islam, and new theories have been published since. You would think that with that many brilliant minds working on a single question for over 1,500 years, we would have arrived at a clean, satisfying answer by now. But we haven't. And the reason we haven't isn't because the question is too hard. It's because most historians have been asking the wrong question entirely. You see, the story most of us learned in school goes something like this. Rome was great. Rome got lazy. Barbarians showed up. And Rome fell in 476 AD when a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus. It is a neat and memorable narrative. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's a villain, there's a victim, there's even a poetic irony baked in because the last emperor shared his name with Rome's legendary founder, Romulus. It almost seems too perfectly scripted. And in a very real sense, it was. Because the idea that Rome fell in 476 is not an ancient observation. It is a piece of political propaganda invented decades after the fact, and we have been repeating it as gospel truth ever since. So today we are going to examine and challenge the conventional story of Rome's collapse. We are going to look at what actually happened, who manufactured the version of history we've inherited, and why the real causes of Rome's unraveling are far more unsettling and far more relevant to our own world than the sanitized textbook version. This is a story about currency manipulation, climate catastrophe, pandemic disease, institutional rot, outsourced military power, and the terrifying fragility of systems that seem too big to fail. Let me take you back to the beginning. The first thing to understand is that people living in 476 did not believe the Roman world had suddenly come to an end. To the people living in Italy at the time, what Odoacer did was not particularly unusual. The Western Roman Empire had been lurching from one crisis to another for over a century. Emperors had been deposed, murdered, and replaced with dizzying regularity. In the decades before Odoacer's coup, the real power in the West hadn't even rested with the emperor. It rested with military strongmen, many of whom were themselves of Germanic origin. Odoacer forcing a teenager off the throne was, in the context of the times, just another Tuesday in a long string of terrible Tuesdays. The Senate in Rome continued to function. The laws didn't change overnight. The aqueducts still carried water. Life for the average person in Italy was not dramatically different on the morning after the coup than it had been the morning before. So, where did the idea of a dramatic fall in 476 come from? The answer lies not in Rome, but in Constantinople, in the eastern half of the empire, which very much still existed and considered itself the legitimate continuation of the Roman state. In the 510s, roughly 40 years after Odoacer's coup, a chronicler named Marcellinus comes, who was closely associated with the Eastern Roman court, wrote that when Odoacer took control of Rome, the Western Empire had perished. This was not simply a neutral historical observation, it also served a clear political purpose. Marcellinus was writing in the orbit of Justinian, the ambitious Eastern emperor who was building a case for reconquering Italy. If the Western Empire had perished under a barbarian usurper, then Justinian had every right, even a moral obligation, to take it back by force. The manufactured fall of 476 became the legal and rhetorical justification for a devastating war, and devastating it was. In 535, Justinian launched his invasion of Italy, claiming he was liberating Roman territory from Gothic occupation. The fighting would drag on for nearly 3 decades. The city of Rome changed hands 5 times between 536 and 552. The population of the city, which had already been declining, was decimated. Italy's infrastructure, its roads, its farms, its trade networks were shattered. The historian Brian Crook put it memorably when he called the fall of Rome in 476 a manufactured historical turning point that has become an accepted historical fact. For Italy, the deeper catastrophe was not Odoacer's relatively bloodless coup. It was Justinian's war of reconquest waged under the banner of restoring an empire that, from Italy's perspective, had never really died. For 1,500 years, we have been pointing at the wrong date and blaming the wrong people. But even if 476 is the wrong moment to pick as the end, there is no question that the Western Roman Empire experienced a profound decline. The question isn't whether something went terribly wrong. The question is what actually went wrong, and whether the popular explanations hold up under scrutiny. Let us begin with perhaps the most famous explanation of all. In 1776, the same year that a group of American colonists were declaring their independence from Britain, an English historian named Edward Gibbon published the first volume of what would become one of the most influential works of history ever written. It was called The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and it ran to 6 massive volumes over the course of more than a decade. Gibbon was a magnificent prose stylist and a diligent researcher, and his work established the framework through which generations of historians, students, and ordinary people would understand Rome's collapse. His central thesis was both bold and provocative. Gibbon placed much of the blame on Christianity. According to Gibbon, the rise of Christianity sapped Rome of its civic virtue. The old Roman religion had been bound up with the identity of the state. The emperor had divine status. Loyalty to Rome and loyalty to the gods were the same thing. But Christianity redirected people's energy and devotion away from the earthly empire and toward a heavenly kingdom. It encouraged pacifism, otherworldliness, and withdrawal from public life. Monasteries pulled able-bodied men out of productive society. Church leaders accumulated political power and wealth that might otherwise have strengthened the state. In Gibbon's telling, Rome essentially lost the will to fight because its people had become too focused on the next world to defend this one. It is an elegant argument, and for generations it exercised enormous influence. But it has one enormous, glaring problem that Gibbon himself never adequately addressed. If Christianity weakened Rome, then why did the Eastern Roman Empire, which was centered in Constantinople and was significantly more Christian than the West, not only survive, but thrive for another 1,000 years? The Eastern Empire was steeped in Christian devotion. Constantinople was the greatest Christian city in the world. Its emperor was considered God's representative on earth. And yet, this deeply, profoundly Christian state endured until 1453, when it finally fell to the Ottoman Turks, nearly a millennium after the Western Empire disintegrated. If Christianity was the poison that killed Rome, the East should have died first. It didn't. It outlived the West by a factor of 10. The historian Will Durant argued that the growth of Christianity was more an effect than a cause of Rome's decay. People turned to a new faith because the old systems were already them. In this interpretation, Christianity filled an existing vacuum rather than creating it. But Gibbon's shadow is long, and his thesis continues to echo in popular culture, in documentaries, in casual conversations about why civilizations fall. So, let's set it aside and look at what the evidence actually tells us about the forces that dismantled the Western Empire. To understand why the Western half collapsed while the Eastern half endured, it is essential to follow the money, because the single most underappreciated factor in Rome's decline is the systematic destruction of its own monetary system. And this didn't happen by accident. It was a deliberate choice made by emperors who were trapped in a cycle of escalating costs and diminishing revenues. For the first 2 centuries of the empire, the Roman economy ran on a coin called the denarius. It was a small silver coin, roughly 4.5 grosz of nearly pure silver, and it was accepted everywhere from the foggy shores of Britain to the sun-scorched markets of Egypt. The denarius was the dollar of the ancient world. Its value was trusted because its silver content was consistent and standardized by the Roman state. When a farmer in Gaul accepted a denarius in exchange for his grain, he knew exactly what he was getting. When a soldier on the Danube frontier received his pay in denarii, he could spend that money anywhere in the empire with confidence. That monetary stability was one of Roman civilization's major economic achievements. It allowed long-distance trade to flourish, it allowed the government to collect taxes efficiently, and it gave ordinary people a reliable store of value. But maintaining an empire of that scale was enormously expensive. The Roman army, which at its height numbered somewhere around 300,000 to 400,000 men, was by far the largest single expenditure. Soldiers expected regular pay, bonuses upon retirement, increasingly lavish donatives which were essentially bribes paid by new emperors to secure the army's loyalty. On top of military costs, there was the enormous expense of maintaining roads, aqueducts, public buildings, grain distributions for the urban poor, and the bureaucratic apparatus that held the whole thing together. And as the empire's borders stabilized in the 2nd century, the easy revenue that had come from conquering new territories and plundering their wealth dried up. Rome's expenditures were increasingly exceeding its revenues, and the gap continued to grow. The solution that emperors stumbled upon was deceptively simple. If you are running out of silver, you can stretch your supply by reducing the silver content in each coin while keeping its face value the same. This is called debasement, and it is functionally identical to what modern governments do when they print money. Under the Emperor Nero, the silver content of the denarius was reduced from around 98% to about 93%. It was a small cut, and for a while most people accepted the coins at face value without noticing. But the precedent had been set, and once the door to debasement was opened, it was never closed again. Under Commodus, the silver content dropped further. Under Septimius Severus, it fell to around 50%. And then came the Emperor Caracalla in the early 200s, who not only debased the coinage further, but also introduced a new coin called the Antoninianus, which was supposed to be worth 2 denarii, but contained only about 1.5 denarii worth of silver. It was a mathematical trick designed to extract more spending power from less metal, and for a brief moment, it worked. Caracalla used the inflated currency to raise soldiers' pay by 50%, buying their loyalty with money that was quietly becoming worthless. He reportedly declared that nobody should have any money but him, so that he could bestow it upon the soldiers. It was a naked admission that the currency existed to serve the state's military needs, not the people's economic ones. By the middle of the 3rd century, the empire was plunging into what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period of near total collapse. Between 235 and 284, the empire was racked by civil wars, foreign invasions, plagues, and economic disintegration. Dozens of emperors rose and fell, most of them through military coups. Each new emperor needed immediate cash to secure the loyalty of his troops, and the fastest way to get it was to debase the currency even further. By 268, the denarius contained only about 0.5% silver. It was essentially a bronze coin with a thin silver wash on the surface. The economic consequences became catastrophic. Prices across the empire rose by roughly 1,000%. Soldiers demanded higher wages because their existing pay could no longer buy anything. Merchants raised prices or abandoned markets entirely. Long-distance trade, which had been the lifeblood of the Roman economy, collapsed because no one trusted the currency anymore. In rural areas, people abandoned money altogether and reverted to barter. The sophisticated, interconnected economy that had made Rome great was fragmenting into isolated, self-sufficient pockets. This was far more than an inconvenience. It represented a fundamental transformation of the social order. Large landowners who could no longer export their crops profitably began producing food for subsistence and local trade only. They started manufacturing goods on their own estates rather than importing them from urban workshops. Free citizens from the cities migrated to the countryside in search of food and protection, and many of them attached themselves to these large estates as dependent laborers. What was emerging, slowly and painfully, was the decentralized, rural, estate-based economy that would eventually become medieval feudalism. The seeds of the Middle Ages were being planted not by barbarian invasions, but by monetary collapse. The Emperor Diocletian, who came to power in 284 and managed to stabilize the empire after the worst of the crisis, tried to address inflation through a different approach. In 301, he issued the famous Edict on Maximum Prices, which attempted to fix the prices of nearly 1,300 essential and services. The penalty for charging more than the official price was death. The edict's preamble blamed greedy merchants and speculators for the inflation, comparing them to barbarian enemies of the state. But price controls don't address the underlying problem, which was that the money itself was worthless. Producers responded by pulling their goods off the market entirely, selling them on the black market or reverting to barter. The edict ultimately failed spectacularly. Within 4 years, Diocletian himself had abdicated, and the edict was quietly abandoned. Here is a critical point that many popular histories underemphasize. The eastern half of the empire endured the monetary crisis considerably better than the West. Constantinople sat at the crossroads of trade routes connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa. Wealth flowed through it like water through a funnel. The Eastern government maintained a more efficient tax collection system and a more competent bureaucracy. Each year, the imperial government in Constantinople brought in vastly more revenue than its Western counterpart. The East was also geographically more defensible. Constantinople itself was practically impregnable, ringed by massive walls on its landward side and protected by water on the other three. The Western Empire, by contrast, had to defend thousands of miles of open frontier along the Rhine and Danube rivers. Its tax base was steadily eroding as wealthy landowners fled to the countryside to escape the taxman. The fiscal collapse that destroyed the West's ability to maintain its army simply didn't happen in the East, at least not until much later. But currency debasement and fiscal breakdown were not the only invisible forces eating away at the empire. There was another one, and until very recently, historians didn't even know it existed. Over the past 2 decades, a revolution has taken place in our understanding of ancient climate. Scientists studying tree rings, ice cores from Greenland, cave formations, and lake sediment deposits have reconstructed the climate of the Roman world with a level of precision that would have astonished historians just a generation ago. What this research has revealed is remarkable. The Roman Empire rose and flourished during a period of unusually warm, stable, and wet climate conditions that scientists now call the Roman climate optimum. This warm period lasted from roughly 200 BCE to about 150 CE, coinciding almost perfectly with Rome's greatest period of prosperity and expansion. Warmer temperatures meant longer growing seasons. More rainfall meant higher agricultural yields. And in an economy where roughly 90% of the population was involved in farming, good weather wasn't just pleasant. It was the foundation of everything. But climate never remained static, and the Roman climate optimum eventually came to an end. Beginning in the mid-2nd century, the climate began to shift. Temperatures became more variable. Droughts became more frequent in some regions, while others experienced unseasonal flooding. And these shifts did not happen in isolation. They coincided with, and may have directly triggered some of the most devastating events in Roman history. Consider the Antonine Plague, which struck the empire between 165 and 180 CE. At its peak, this epidemic was killing roughly 2,000 people per day in the city of Rome alone. Modern scholars believe it was most likely smallpox, and it may have killed between 5 and 10 million people across the empire, somewhere between 7 and 10% of the total population. It struck at the exact moment when the climate was beginning to deteriorate. And recent research by the historian Kyle Harper has suggested that these events were not coincidental. Climate stress weakened populations, disrupted ecosystems, and created conditions in which infectious diseases could spread more easily and more lethally. Then came the Cyprian plague in the mid-3rd century, roughly 251 to 270 CE, which may have been even more devastating. This epidemic coincided exactly with the worst of the crisis of the 3rd century, when the empire was already reeling from civil wars and economic collapse. The double blow of plague and political chaos pushed the empire to the brink of disintegration. Entire provinces were depopulated. Tax revenues plummeted. The army struggled to fill its ranks. The 5th century historian Orosius described how towns and fields were left without inhabitants, with nothing remaining but ruins and forests. The western provinces, which had less economic cushioning than the wealthy east, were hit hardest. But the most dramatic climate event was still to come, and it struck not during the Western Empire's decline, but during what should have been its revival. In the 530s and 540s, the world experienced a series of massive volcanic eruptions, unlike anything seen in the previous few thousand years. Dendrochronologists, scientists who study tree rings, have identified 536 as one of the worst years in recorded human history. The eruptions threw so much dust and sulfur into the atmosphere that temperatures across the northern hemisphere plummeted. Contemporary accounts describe a mysterious fog that dimmed the sun for months. Crops failed across Europe and the Mediterranean. This violent sequence of eruptions triggered what scientists now call the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a period of significantly colder temperatures that endured for at least 150 years. And riding on the heels of this climate catastrophe came something even worse. In 541, the plague of Justinian, the first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, erupted in the Eastern Empire. It struck Constantinople with devastating force, killing perhaps 30 to 50% of the city's population. It then spread across the Mediterranean world, returning in waves for the next 2 centuries. The timing was not accidental. Climate disruption altered ecosystems, shifting the ranges of rodents and the fleas they carried, creating the conditions for plague to leap from animal reservoirs into human populations. The plague of Justinian may have reduced the total population of the Mediterranean world by 25%. It devastated the Eastern Empire and made Justinian's already bloody reconquest of Italy even more catastrophic. The historian Ian Morris at Stanford University created a Universal Social Development Index, a way of measuring the overall complexity and sophistication of civilizations across history. When he plotted the trajectory of the Roman world, the fall of Rome emerged as the greatest setback in the history of human civilization, not the worst single event, but the largest sustained regression. The material standard of living in Western Europe would not return to Roman-era levels for roughly 1,000 years. A common Roman citizen in 2nd century Britain had access to mass-produced pottery, diverse food imports, heated bathhouses, and clean water. 2 centuries after the Western Empire's collapse, even Anglo-Saxon kings lived in conditions that would have been considered impoverished by Roman standards. This was not simply a gentle transition from one cultural system to another. Materially, it was catastrophic. And yet, for decades, a school of revisionist historians tried to argue exactly that. Beginning in the 1970s, a movement emerged in academic circles to reframe the fall of Rome as a transformation. Scholars championed a new concept called late antiquity, covering roughly 200 to 800 CE, which they described not as a period of collapse, but as a period of cultural transition. Germanic peoples didn't invade and destroy. according to this view, they migrated and integrated. The successor kingdoms that replaced the Western Empire were not inferior. They were merely different. All cultures are equally valid, the argument went, and characterizing the end of Rome as a fall imposed a value judgment that modern scholars should avoid. This revisionist movement was partly a necessary corrective. The older narrative had often been tinged with racism, portraying noble Romans being overrun by savage barbarians. The historical reality was considerably more complex. Many Germanic leaders had spent years within the Roman system, spoke Latin, admired Roman culture, and saw themselves as continuing Roman traditions, not destroying them. The Visigothic king who sacked Rome in 410 was himself a former Roman military commander. The lines between Roman and barbarian were far blurrier than the old textbooks suggested, but the revisionist pendulum swung too far. The archaeologist Brian Ward Perkins, in his influential book, The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization, marshaled an overwhelming body of physical evidence to show that what happened in the Western Empire during the 5th and 6th centuries was, by any objective measure, a disaster. Pottery production, which is an excellent proxy for economic complexity because it requires specialization, trade networks, and consumer demand, collapsed almost entirely in Britain and severely declined across Western Europe. Roof tiles, which had been ubiquitous in even modest Roman buildings, disappeared from the archaeological record for centuries. Coinage became scarce. Long-distance trade networks dissolved. Cities shrank to a fraction of their former size or were abandoned entirely. The material evidence presents a picture that is extremely difficult to romanticize. Things got dramatically worse for the vast majority of people. Ward Perkins attributed part of the revisionist impulse to the European politics of the 1950s and 60s, when politicians and intellectuals were trying to sell the idea of European unity. In that political climate, it was useful to portray the transition from Roman to Germanic rule as smooth and collaborative, a peaceful merging of cultures that foreshadowed the modern European project. The idea that Germanic invasions had violently destroyed a sophisticated civilization didn't fit the narrative, and so scholars softened the language, swapped invasion for migration, replaced collapse with transformation, and rebranded the Dark Ages as late antiquity. The reinterpretation may have been well-intentioned, but it could also be misleading. Now let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where the conventional wisdom gets closest to the truth, but still misses the deeper pattern. Everyone knows that barbarian invasions played a role in Rome's fall, but the way most people picture it as a dramatic military defeat, wave after wave of savage warriors overwhelming the legions, is largely wrong. The Western Empire was not destroyed by one decisive military defeat. It fell because the army, the institution that had been the backbone of Roman power for centuries, was slowly hollowed out from within. Rome had always recruited outsiders into its military. From the Republic onward, non-Roman peoples served in auxiliary units, and this was considered a strength, not a weakness. The Roman army was extraordinarily effective at taking men from diverse backgrounds and turning them into disciplined professional soldiers who identified as Roman. A Syrian archer and a Gallic cavalryman might have nothing in common culturally, but put them both in Roman armor, drill them in Roman tactics, pay them in Roman coin, and after 25 years of service, grant them Roman citizenship. And they became Romans in every way that mattered. This ability to assimilate outsiders was one of Rome's most important institutional strengths. But in the 4th and 5th centuries, this system broke down. The empire's shrinking tax base meant less money to pay soldiers. The demographic impact of plagues meant fewer citizens available for recruitment. And the growing pressure on the frontiers meant the army needed more men, not fewer. The solution was to increasingly rely on what were called foederati, allied barbarian groups who fought for Rome under their own leaders in exchange for land, payments, or political recognition. On paper, this was a practical arrangement. In practice, it was a slow-motion surrender of the state's monopoly on military force. The crucial difference between the older system and the newer arrangement was the question of loyalty. An individual barbarian recruited into the Roman army served under Roman officers, trained in Roman methods, and was paid by the Roman state. His loyalty was to the empire. But a federati contingent served under its own chieftain, maintained its own internal command structure, and owed its primary loyalty to its own leader, not to the emperor. When the Roman government failed to pay these groups, mistreated them, or tried to use them as pawns in internal power struggles, the federati could and did turn against their nominal employers. The most catastrophic example of this dynamic was the crisis that began in 376, when the Goths, fleeing the terrifying advance of the Huns from the east, begged the Eastern Empire for permission to cross the Danube and settle within Roman territory. The Emperor Valens agreed, but Roman officials on the ground treated the Gothic refugees with appalling cruelty. They exploited the Goths' desperation, forcing starving families to sell their children into slavery in exchange for dog meat. When the Goths' patience finally snapped, they rose up in rebellion. At the Battle of Adrianople in 378, a Gothic army annihilated the Eastern Roman field army and killed Emperor Valens himself. It was one of the worst military disasters in Roman history, and it established a pattern that would repeat again and again. Rome increasingly depended on barbarian forces that it could not always control. It invited them in, mistreated them, and then paid the price when they fought back. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman army was essentially a collection of barbarian contingents, loosely coordinated by a Roman government that had less and less actual power. The great Roman general Aetius, who defeated Attila the Hun at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains in 451, did so primarily with an army of Visigoths, Franks, and other Germanic allies. He was arguably the last man who held the Western Empire together, and when he was murdered by the Emperor Valentinian III in 454, in a fit of jealous paranoia, the last thread snapped. Within 2 decades, the Western Empire had ceased to exist as a functional state. And here is the part that most popular accounts leave out entirely. The Eastern Empire faced similar pressures, similar barbarian threats, similar military challenges, but it managed them far more effectively. Constantinople's greater wealth meant it could pay its barbarian allies reliably. Its more defensible position meant it was less dependent on frontier armies. And critically, the Eastern government made a strategic decision in the late 5th century to redirect the Gothic threat away from its own territory and toward the west. When the Ostrogothic king Theodoric marched on Italy in 488, he did so with the explicit encouragement of the Eastern Emperor Zeno, who was happy to get a dangerous military force out of his backyard and into someone else's. The West didn't just collapse under the weight of barbarian pressure. It was in a very real sense sacrificed by the East. So what actually brought down the Western Roman Empire? The most convincing answer is that no single factor was responsible. It was a cascading breakdown across multiple interconnected systems. Climate deterioration undermined agricultural productivity and destabilized ecosystems. Pandemic diseases killed vast numbers of people and shattered the labor force. Currency debasement destroyed the monetary system and fragmented the economy. Fiscal collapse left the government unable to pay for the army it needed. Military dependence on federati transferred military power from the state to barbarian leaders who had no institutional loyalty to Rome. Political instability and civil wars consumed the attention and resources of the ruling class. And the Eastern Empire, which had the wealth and strategic position to survive these pressures, actively diverted threats toward its weaker Western counterpart. No single one of these pressures necessarily had to be fatal on its own. Rome had survived individual crises before. It survived the devastation of Hannibal's invasion. It survived the civil wars that destroyed the Republic. It survived the crisis of the 3rd century. What was different about the 5th century was that all of these pressures converged simultaneously. And the Western Empire simply didn't have the reserves, fiscal, demographic, or institutional, to absorb them all at once. And there's one more thing that the conventional story gets wrong, perhaps the most important thing of all. Rome did not simply disappear in a single moment. The idea that there was a moment when Rome ceased to exist is itself a myth. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we retrospectively call the Byzantine Empire, continued to exist for another 1,000 years. Its people called themselves Romans. Their emperor ruled under Roman law. Their legal system was Roman. Their administration was Roman. They did not think of themselves as a successor state or a new civilization. They were Rome, and they were deeply offended when Western Europeans eventually started referring to them as anything else. The Germanic kings who ruled in the West also didn't see themselves as destroyers of Rome. They saw themselves as inheritors of Roman authority. They adopted Roman legal codes, maintained Roman administrative structures, and sought recognition from the emperor in Constantinople. The Frankish king Clovis received the honorary title of consul from the Eastern emperor. The Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy maintained the Roman Senate, preserved Roman law, and kept Roman aristocrats in positions of power. The fall of Rome was in many ways more of a political fragmentation than a civilizational extinction. Roman culture, Roman law, Roman religion, and Roman institutions continued to shape Europe for centuries after 476. But an important distinction needs to be made. The fact that the fall was more complex than the textbooks suggest does not mean it wasn't real. It was profoundly real for the millions of people who lived through it. The material evidence on this point is difficult to dispute. Living standards collapsed, life expectancy shortened, trade networks vanished, literacy declined, cities emptied. The sophisticated, interconnected world that Rome had built was replaced by something smaller, poorer, and more dangerous. Calling this a transformation instead of a collapse is like calling a building demolition a structural reorganization. The building is still gone, and the people who lived in it are still homeless. What historians often get wrong is not the fact that Rome declined. What they get wrong is the cause. They look for a single, satisfying explanation. Christianity, barbarians, moral decay, lead poisoning. And they miss the truth, which is that Rome was killed by the interaction of forces that no single ruler or reform could have controlled. The climate shifted, and harvests failed. Disease swept through weakened populations. The currency was debased to fund an army that was increasingly composed of mercenaries whose loyalty couldn't be bought permanently. Tax revenues dried up as the economy fragmented. And all happened against a backdrop of relentless military pressure from peoples who were themselves being pushed by forces beyond their control, like the westward migration of the Huns. The lead poisoning theory, by the way, is a perfect case study in how a neat-sounding explanation can take on a life of its own even when the evidence doesn't support it. The idea, popularized in the 1960s by a sociologist named Seabury Colum Gilfillan, was that Rome's elite poisoned themselves by using lead pipes for water, lead-lined cooking vessels, and a lead-based syrup called sapa to sweeten their wine. This chronic exposure supposedly caused infertility, cognitive decline, and erratic behavior among Rome's ruling class, leading to the empire's downfall. It is a compelling theory because it provides a clear villain, the lead itself, and it's been repeated endlessly in popular media. But a comprehensive scientific review published in 2026 by researchers Simpson and Garvey Locke examined ancient texts, archaeological remains, and bioarchaeological evidence from human bones, and concluded that the theory is significantly overstated. While Romans were certainly exposed to lead, the evidence does not support the idea that this exposure was severe enough to cause systemic civilizational decline. As one researcher put it, lead exposure may have been one factor among many, but it was far from a death blow. It's a reminder that history favors dramatic explanations, even when the mundane ones are closer to the truth. The real lesson of Rome's fall, if we are brave enough to accept it, is that complex systems can collapse even when no single component fails catastrophically. It is the interaction of multiple stresses, each one perhaps manageable on its own, that produces catastrophic outcomes. The Roman Empire did not die from one single wound. It bled out from 1,000 cuts, many of which were invisible to the people living through them. Currency debasement is subtle. Climate shifts unfold over decades. Pandemic diseases are attributed to divine punishment or bad air. Institutional decay happens so slowly that each generation accepts a slightly diminished version of normal without realizing what has been lost. And this is one reason the story of Rome's fall continues to matter today. Not because our civilization is identical to Rome's, but because the patterns are uncomfortably familiar. Monetary systems strained by the need to fund ever-increasing commitments, climate disruptions that stress agricultural systems and displace populations, pandemic diseases that overwhelm public health infrastructure, military commitments that outstrip the state's ability to pay for them. Institutional trust eroding so gradually that no one can point to the moment it broke. These are not exclusively ancient problems. They are recurring human problems, and they do not respect the passage of time. The Roman Empire at its height was the most sophisticated, interconnected, and prosperous civilization the world had ever seen. Its citizens believed, with considerable justification, that they had mastered the natural world. They built aqueducts that carried clean water over mountains. They constructed roads that connected an empire spanning 3 continents. They developed legal systems that still form the basis of law in much of the world today. And yet, when the climate shifted, when the plagues came, when the currency crumbled, when the soldiers could no longer be paid, all of that sophistication could not save them. The Romans thought they had the upper hand over the fickle and furious power of the natural environment. They were wrong. The question is whether we will be wise enough to learn from their mistake, or whether we'll simply add our own civilization to the long list of empires that thought they were too big to fail. If this story changed the way you think about the fall of Rome, or about the fragility of the systems we take for granted today, then do me a favor and hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because we're going deep on stories like this. The kind that most people never hear. The kind that challenge what you thought you knew. And if you want to keep going, there's a video on screen right now that I think you're going to find just as eye-opening. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.